Recently, the Supreme Court made two very important decisions, almost back to back. On the one hand, they expanded the rights of homosexual couples, but on the other hand, they restricted the rights of people returning from prison and others to vote. And we're going to talk about that today. Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is David Schuringa. I'm the president of Crossroad Bible Institute and the host of your program. I have with me in the studio today a good friend and colleague, Myrna Perez. Myrna Perez is the deputy director of the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University of Law. Not only are you the deputy director there, but also you're a professor at the New York University of Law. Welcome, Myrna.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's just a delight to have you here. I'm on the Community of Faith Advisory Council, and you invited me to come to Washington, D.C. to have not a hearing, but a sort of a press event.
Briefing. We call it a briefing.
A briefing there to talk about this very important issue of the right to vote of people returning from prison. And this has been your focus of your work for the last 7 years or so, to work on this issue. And so we've been talking about it, and you've become really an expert in this, and I want to talk more about that today. And
Sure.
As I mentioned at the top of the program, the Supreme Court recently made a decision about voting rights.
It made two big decisions, in fact.
Would
this
you
was
explain what those decisions are?
Sure. This was an incredibly important term for the Supreme Court with respect to the right to vote. There were two very big decisions that were issued. One had to do with what Congress's power was under the Elections Clause of the Constitution. The other one had to do with Congress's power under the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And they both played out in different ways. So the Supreme Court made the determination in a case called Shelby County versus Arizona that Congress had overstepped its authority when it implemented particular provisions of the historic Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been universally hailed as the single most effective piece of voting rights
decision.
Yes, the single most effective piece of voting rights legislation we had in the country. And there was a particular provision that was credited for much of that success. And that particular provision was called the Preclearance provision, or the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And what it said was that certain jurisdictions that have a history of discrimination in voting needed to have a review by either a judge or the Department of Justice that any election law change that they'd make would not be discriminatory. And that
was 65.
That was a 65 Act, and it's been reauthorized in numerous different times by Congress, and the Supreme Court has upheld that provision, that has upheld Congress's right to combat voting discrimination.
This is a preventative measure.
It's a preventative measure, and the Supreme Court upheld it 4 different times. In this most recent Supreme Court term, the Supreme Court upheld that provision that said the preclearance the act of preclearance was constitutional, but what it said was unconstitutional was how Congress decided who was subject to preclearance. Because not everybody had to preclear, only those jurisdictions with certain histories. And that has effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act. Because if you cannot say this constitutional provision applies in this place or in this place, and it doesn't apply anywhere until you figure out where it can apply, it's not working anywhere. And so we have seen the impact of this. North Carolina very recently passed an omnibus bill which would impose a lot of restrictions on the right to vote. So that is one Supreme Court decision.
And is that a situation where the 65 decision would no longer monitor that?
Right now, there is no place in the country that is subject to preclearance. Even though the Supreme Court said preclearance is still constitutional, because they struck down what's called the formula. They struck down the part that says these particular states, these particular jurisdictions, these particular localities have to preclear.
Now, why did they do this?
That is a very long and complicated decision, and I don't try to get into
Motives.
the hearts and minds of people. But what I do know is we are seeing the consequences of those happening.
What are
even
those
today.
consequences?
So we've seen restrictive laws being passed in North Carolina.
Since then?
Since the act
Really?
came down over the summer, North Carolina passed a law that many people have opined is one of the most regressive voting laws we have seen in this country since the Jim Crow era.
Who are those laws affecting?
They affect poor people, they affect people of color, they affect elderly people. But what I think is the most important part to remember in that is that there are legislators in North Carolina that were willing to say to newspapers, oh, well, we were only going to pass a law that had to do with photo identification, but once there was no preclearance, we decided we could add more to it. So the preclearance provision actually deterred bad behavior. There's pretty good research and evidence on that fact. I encourage any of your audience who is interested in looking at this to look at a Brennan Center report called "If Section 5 Falls," and you can find that on BrennanCenter.org. But that's one decision. The other decision had to do with Congress's power under the Election Clause of the Constitution, and it basically came into play because the state of Arizona wanted to, and in fact did, pass a law requiring a voter to present documentary proof of citizenship before registering to vote. And there was a determination by an appellate court that was inconsistent with the federal law called the National Voter Registration Act. You guys might call it motor voter. It's like the motor voter law, like the way that when you go to register, when you go and try and get your license at the DMV, they ask you if you want to vote. And so it became a very technical question as to whether or not Congress had the power to enact the motor voter law if it conflicted with the state constitution, if it conflicted with state law. And in this determination, the Supreme Court said yes. Congress's power under the Election Clause allowed the NVRA to trump, in this case, state law. But what the case called into question was what kinds of things could be decided by Congress. Mm-hmm. And so there is a view and a concern by some that particular provision will be read to prevent Congress from taking act to do things like restore voting rights to persons with criminal convictions in federal elections. But what I think cannot get lost in all of this is that we as a country believe in second chances. We do not look at someone and try to say that you are the sum and the only the worst thing that you've ever done in your life. We understand that people are complicated, people have complicated lives, and we have rules for that. But we also allow and want people to redeem themselves. We want people to work for their redemption. We expect the society to help them to restore the fallen, to set our transgressors back onto the right path. And voting when you are out in the community is an example of that restoration. We are trying to literally bring people back into the fold. I always liken it to any, pick your parable about, the woman looking for a coin and or the shepherd looking for the lost sheep. Like, we as a country have decided that we are going to make the effort to restore our fallen. And if we're going to do that, that includes restoring their right to vote.
Well, to me, and we don't have to get into a theological discussion, but that whole forgiveness and everything, the way we should be functioning, I think it is something that speaks to the depth and the breadth of the atonement of Christ on the cross. In the Old Testament, before the cross, there was all kinds of constant payback and retribution and so forth because of the mess that men and women got themselves into. But the moral order was reset at the cross, wasn't it?
Right.
And so in the New Testament, there's no more payback.
Well, he came to preach release to the captive.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So we need to be modeling that and be his hands and feet here. A question: the Supreme Court decision. Am I correct? It seems to have given states more rights, more power to fiddle with these voting requirements. the Democracy Restoration Act, which you've been working on and we've been supporting, was an idea was a plan at the federal level to bring more uniformity because of the chaos of the patchwork of all these states. Do I have that right? Did the Supreme Court just set the Democracy Restoration Act back?
Maybe. What we do know is that we have a complicated and rightful tension between state power and federal power
Sure.
when it comes to elections. And under our Constitution, states have certain rights, and
it's a good balance.
And the federal, and it's
Yep.
a good balance,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a balance that is negotiated, and we're working it out as a country. And in some eras, we lean more one way, and in other eras, we lean more others. But there are a couple of things that are clear. There is clear that the Constitution says that Congress has the right to end racial discrimination in voting. It says that in the 15th Amendment. They are the ones that have to enforce this.
There's federal responsibility to monitor discrimination
in voting. And then you also have the agreement that was upheld by the Supreme Court in the Arizona versus ITCA case, that Congress has the power to regulate its own federal elections. And so the question that we as a country are going to be grappling with next is what happens when you have laws like those laws that are disenfranchising persons with criminal convictions, that do have a racist past, do have a disproportionately racial consequence, and have to do with state qualifications. And so the Democracy Restoration Act was a piece of legislation that would have allowed Congress to regulate federal elections and to be able to set some standard and some uniformity for federal elections. And what this decision has done has emboldened certain states. For right now, we have 2 states that are saying they're going to have 2 sets of roll books. They're going to have roll books for state elections.
One for federal, one for state?
One for states.
How will they ever keep that straight?
Again, states have certain rights to monitor their elections, and we'll see how they're doing it. But one of the things that we as a country need to ask ourselves is how many unnecessary barriers are we going to put in front of the ballot box? And we already have difficulty in administering smooth elections. Everyone remembers after the last election, there were extraordinarily long lines in some parts of the country. We all heard of very elderly people having to stand 6-7 hours. And the president, in no fewer than 3 speeches, said we had to fix these long lines. The question that I would submit is that we should be spending our resources, our brain power, our best effort in trying to make it easier for eligible Americans to vote. And when we are going to impose restrictions on that right to vote, they need to be based on data, very strong justifications, and done so in the context that there's something lost, that we lose something by cutting people out, instead of having these knee-jerk responses that say, oh, I want to punish X, or oh, I want to punish Y. We are all equal before God. We all have certain gifts, and we all have certain limitations. And I think the research is pretty clear that if we want people to be effective members of society, we want people voting.
Yeah, absolutely. That just makes so much sense, and makes good biblical sense to me as a pastor. And yeah, our time keeps flying by here. But just to give folks an idea of how the laws can be set up, that they're so confusing. I think I heard you lecture one time, and you talked about that. How is that someone on parole?
So yeah, let's use the state that I work in. I teach
Okay.
I work and teach in New York. In New York, you are allowed to vote if you are on probation, but not if you're on parole.
You could vote if you're on probation, but not if you're on parole.
And
I've been in prison ministry now for 15 years. I don't know what the difference is.
A lot of people don't know what the difference is, and unfortunately, election officials sometimes don't know
Right.
the difference. We have had instances where people who are lawfully entitled to vote have been told that they can't.
Right.
And that kind of confusion isn't good for anybody, right? We have a hard enough time trying to make sure our voting machines are working, trying to make sure we have enough paper ballots when the voting machines don't work, that we have very well-trained poll workers, that we have enough polling locations to make sure people aren't lying, to be creating these unnecessary administrative hurdles that aren't really helping anyone. And that is one of the reasons why there are a number of election officials that think that we should just have, a bright line rule that says, if you can get yourself to the polls, then you're allowed to vote. And then there's not any confusion about whether or not your crime fits into the disenfranchising crime. There are some states that actually make a list. These are the kinds of crimes that, that you can't vote. I mean, election administrators aren't criminal justice professionals. They're trying to get people their ballots. And to be putting them in that role, I think, does a disservice to us all, because they're not doing what we need them to do, which is to run our elections.
Well, Crossroad has also been supporting an organization right here in Michigan called Unlock the Vote. We allow returning citizens to vote, but most ex-offenders apparently don't think they have the right to vote.
Right, because there's this confusion because of the way the law is.
So
It
much
is.
confusion.
It is.
30 seconds on voter ID.
What would you like to hear about it?
Good thing, bad thing?
States have different voter ID laws. Some are more restrictive than others. There is zero dispute that someone who presents themselves to vote should be who they say they are. But there is also very little dispute that between 8 and 11% of Americans don't have the kind of ID that some of these states are requiring. Not all of them, but some of them. And my view is that we need a common sense approach for making sure that people are who they say they are, but at the same time, we need to have some way of accommodating those eligible Americans who may not have, the passport or don't need to drive and may not have the driver's license that they want.
So voter ID, if used improperly in certain places, can become another hurdle, like a poll tax or something.
And in some states where you can't get an identification unless you have like a birth certificate or a passport, those documents require money, and it requires, you have to pay a fine, or not a fine, but you have to pay a fee in most instances to get an ID.
Or try to get time off your job to
trying
do
to get
it,
off
right?
your time to job. And so there's no one model that fits. It's a very, what we call as a lawyer, a very fact-specific circumstance where you have to look at the community that's affected, you have to look at the law, and you have to look at what states do to make it easy for people to get those kind of identifications. But I do think we as a country need to ask ourselves, how many barriers are we going to put in front of the ballot box in front of eligible Americans? And and we need to be prepared to say that is too much, because sometimes we are keeping eligible Americans from voting.
Well, Myrna, this has been just a wonderful privilege to have you here on the program. If people want to study up on this, they can go to the BrennanCenter.org.
Right, it's www.BrennanCenter.org.
And they can...
we have lots of materials. We have lots of research. We produce reports. We are an advocacy organization and a think tank. So we have lots of different materials on our website.
Right, and also you're pretty widely covered with op-eds and things like that too.
Right.
So they can Google you up and find things that you've written on that.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you're bothered by this or like it, just email me and you can bawl me out, or you can, whatever you want to say, we can talk about it, because it's an important issue. But it's quite interesting that when you start to think about it, you ask yourself the question, are these folks that aren't allowed to vote made in God's image? And do they have something to contribute? Do they have gifts? Do they have something that's important for society? Anyway, thank you for listening, and thank you, Myrna Perez, for being with us. My name is David Schuringa, and I hope to see you again right here next week.